Well, good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on our Sunday morning video service. Today's Communion Sunday, so if you choose to get your elements and take communion with your family and just really spend some time during this holiday season, Christmas is right around the corner. We're going to be celebrating our Christmas service on December 18th, so we'd love to invite you all out to be a part of that. We're going to have a chili cook-off, so if you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or myself know. I think it's going to be a really special time. The worship team's been working really hard to put together a special event for all of us. And then the following week, we'll just do a small, intimate service, but we will still be having service on Christmas Day. So we'd love to have you be a part of either one of those or both if you'd like. Our ladies group is still meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let myself or Deanne Paradis know. We're not going to be meeting this week, but we'll pick it up next Thursday. Our men's group is meeting on Monday nights, 6:30 here at the Father's house and on Zoom. So if you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl, Pastor Carlos, or CR know, and they'll get you hooked up to be a part of it, whether you want to be present and eat a meal with them or whether you want to be on Zoom and experience it that way. Like I said, today's Communion Sunday. So it's just our regular tithes and offerings. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button and give that way, or you can mail a check to 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you want Pastor Carl and I to come by and pick up your tithes, we'd be happy to do that. That's really all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? I trust you're having a great day and probably staying indoors with this wet weather, but we can complain about it all we want until in the summertime we're complaining that we don't have any water. So I guess it's something we have to live with and enjoy. Really, we could just enjoy this weather. It's time to stay indoors and maybe, I don't know, make yourself a stew, make yourself some chili, whatever the case might be, and enjoy the time. I guess I could make pierogies, but I probably won't because I don't have any potatoes at the house. Otherwise, I might make those. But then again, I would put a lot of weight onto my stomach if I did that, so I'm probably better off not to do that. But Christmas time is here, and so I'll probably do some for Christmas, make homemade pierogies. So if you want a dozen, by all means, let me know. I charge $2 a piece. So that means for a dozen, that's 24. No, not really. But if you do want some, I might make some for you. So anyway, just let me know if you're a pierogi lover. Where are we? Well, we're still talking in the book of James, so I think we're going to just continue with that today. And we're kind of getting close to getting our live stream up. We're working on it. It seems like as we get it all put together, what you find is you always need more parts than what they tell you need. So we had to order more parts, and hopefully they'll be here in next week maybe, or the following week we'll be able to at least start our first live stream. That's the plan, is to have it up the week before Christmas. Whether or not we make it, I have no idea, but we are trying. With that then, let's go ahead and go into our study in the book of James. I hope you've got your Bible with you. And let's go to James chapter 3, and we can read along together. I know a lot of you probably won't, but maybe you have it on your, well, I guess if you're watching this video, you really can't watch it. If you're watching this video like on your iPhone, you really can't look at the text and listen at the same time. So I guess I'll just have to read the text and you can follow along. Okay, we're in James again, and remember that when we're talking here in the book of James, we're talking about the Christian New Testament representation of the spirit of wisdom, Hagia Sophia, or holy wisdom. And so we're really talking about wisdom here, and we're talking about the wisdom of God. There is a wisdom that's a wisdom of man, and it's profound. It can be very profound. You can find that in people like Aristotle and others, Plato, Socrates, and others. But there's, in the Christian dimension, with us in the spiritual dimension, there's this holy wisdom that is the wisdom of God. And so we're going to talk about that. We've kind of talked about some other things, taming the tongue, talked about the tongue, those different things in the last couple of weeks. And now, again, James, as I said, in this book, he's very fragmented. So now he's changing his thought, and he's going to address the idea of, and he's going to really kind of discuss what holy wisdom looks like as opposed to earthly or natural, or what he would call demonic wisdom. So he's going to kind of play this game between these two types of wisdom, and you can kind of catch it in the text, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So he says in verse 13 of James chapter 3, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic." He's talking about bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." So what James is doing in this text is he's like I said, he's contrasting two different kinds of wisdom. That which is natural earthly wisdom, which he's basically saying, and the kind he's talking about here, he's not even talking about really natural wisdom that man can acquire. He's talking about natural wisdom that's devoid of the good, or devoid of what it would even be to be considered natural wisdom to some extent. So he starts off by talking about the wise man. He says, "Who among you is wise and has understanding?" And he says, let him show forth by his life. But it's interesting in kind of what he's talking about there, paraphrase it that way, because he's talking about the wise man or the wise woman in a certain context here. It's important to understand that when he's saying this, he's just not saying this haphazardly, but he's saying it because he has a certain type of person in mind. What's ironic is the things we've been talking about for the last year concerning the virtues, an extraordinary spirit, about the 7 pillars of wisdom, and now as we go back through the book of James, is exactly what James was talking about. And he says, "Who is it that is among you that is wise and have understanding?" Those are 2 words, right? The first word is Sophia. And in this case, he's really kind of going to be juxtaposing the idea of holy Sophia, or holy wisdom, against that which is the opposite of that, which is demonic, the devoid of wisdom. Really, it's non-wisdom, I guess is a good way to put it. So he says that, and so if you look at that up in the Greek, and you start to realize that what he's talking about when he's talking about wise men and women, he's talking about men and women with an intellectual capacity, which are all humans, and those that have devoted themselves to the wisdom of God or to pursuing wisdom. So he's really talking about philosophers. Philosophers. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, or we could call it maybe the study of wisdom. And so what we're really talking about here is he's talking about people that have given themselves to pursuing wisdom. And it's the exact same thing, or person that he's talking about here, that Solomon talks about in the book of Proverbs, when he talks about to the young men to pursue wisdom, to seek her as silver and fine gold, and actually being more valuable than that. So what he's saying is the pursuers of wisdom are the wise that he's talking about here, and their life and their style of living, their character and their actions are different from that are natural and earthly or demonic. Then the second thing he talks about is the idea of understanding. That word understanding there goes back to the Greek word which we get epistemology from, or theory of knowledge. And it has to do with this idea and this capacity for man to be able to reason well, which is exactly when we talk about the virtue of prudence, right? What prudence is that virtue of practical reasoning where we reason about our moral character in the decisions that we make and the actions that we take thereby, based on our will and our choices to some extent. So what he's talking about here is he's going to now say there are wise men and women, but wisdom isn't something that just falls out of the sky. It's something that you've got to pursue. And if you don't pursue wisdom, you won't have wisdom. It's not something that can be taken for granted. That's why in the book of Proverbs it says it's got to be pursued. And in some cases, James is inferring that the mature man or the mature woman are the ones that have built, and talking about that idea of epistemology, have built one precept upon another precept upon another precept. it's almost like a systematic understanding of reality, a systematic understanding of moral ethics, Christian ethics, the way that we should live our life. And so with that, there's this idea and notion that it doesn't just come easy. And what he's saying is the ones that pursue that live a different style of life, a better life because of it. And so he's going to juxtapose the two. So then he goes on to say after that, he says, now the ones that acquire this wisdom, you can see it in their life. You can see it by the way that they're by their actions and by their works. And he kind of talks about this idea of action and works there. But what he's kind of also talking about is in a bigger picture, not just the things that we do, but it has to do with our conversation. And so that word that he's picking up there, let me get my glasses on, tell you which word it was I'm thinking about here. Behavior. It says, who among you is wise and understand him? Let him show by his good behavior. So that idea there of good behavior here has to do with actions and conversations. The way that we talk, the way that we speak, the things that we speak about, the things that are important to us. And then not only that, but then in the way that we behave. So he's still talking about, in some instances, the virtues that we've been talking about. And it all comes down to behavior. So when you're talking about a wise man or woman, you're talking about those that have pursued the cardinal virtues, the theological virtues, and also wisdom that comes by other sources, whether it be divine scripture, whether it be divine revelation, or through other means. The idea, though, is to acquire wisdom and to let those things become the building blocks or first principles to build the rest of your life on. Now he goes on to say past this, he says there's another kind of non-wisdom, is the best way to put it. It's really devoid of what true wisdom is. And he talks about this idea of jealousy, right? Or bitter jealousy is the word he uses. And then also the idea of selfish ambition or self-interest. Let's talk first about bitter jealousy. What he's talking about there when he talks about bitter jealousy, he adds that word bitter to jealousy. And the reason that he's using that as a modifier is because the word jealousy really is the same word that we get zeal from. So we think about Jesus in the gospel accounts where it says that zeal for his father's house consumed him and he drove out the money changers. That could be translated jealousy. But jealousy is basically a neutral word, meaning that it can be either good or it can be bad based on the context. So the real word here is zeal, but it's kind of hard to translate and know what that means where jealousy doesn't. So he's talking about a jealousy that's a bitter jealousy, or a jealousy for maybe something that somebody else has, a position they have, maybe the money that they have, the house that they have, the car that they have, the life that they have, the reputation that they have. And so there's almost this idea of being bitter in our jealousy for what other people have and the things that we don't have. And so what he's saying here is he's saying that this kind of wisdom is not the wisdom of God. He says, and then add to that the idea of not just bitter jealousy because you don't have something and it's something that you want, or you're aggressively pursuing things out of this attitude. The second thing is selfish ambition, or the idea of doing it for your own self-interests. In a society, when you do everything for your own self-interest, what happens is it kind of comes back down into anarchy, doesn't it? Because it means that we're not looking out for the interest of others. We're only looking out for our self-interest. And if that's the case, then a society breaks down. And so the wise man, of what he's saying here, does nothing out of the idea of bitter jealousy or selfish ambition, because he realizes, or she realizes, a wise woman, that the only thing that it does, it leads to a bitter ruin. It doesn't make a better life for you when you find yourself bitter with jealousy and always wanting what others have. Or the idea that whatever you do is only in your own self-interest. Now, maybe your self-interest would include your family, and it might include your friends, but it might not include everybody. And so you can see it, and then James goes on and says, so you can see that that's a natural wisdom. I mean, that's such a low standard anybody can. It's an earthly wisdom. I mean, even a dog knows how to take care of itself, right? And has a selfish ambition for survival. I mean, that would lower us to the lowest level of animals when all it comes down to is us or the survival of our family or of our friends, and not to consider society and others at large. And so in Christianity, what James is talking about here is that God's calling us as Christians to live a much higher standard than just that of being jealous and having a bitter jealousy for things, and the idea of advancing our own self-interest, that the Christian gospel message always incorporates the other person and thinks of them on equal terms as with ourselves, and promotes them and wants their best and always has their best interest in mind. So that's what he's talking about here. So it goes on from there and he says this type of wisdom isn't wisdom at all. And it's interesting because he calls it demonic. And so when you think about him talking about, thinking about bitter jealousy and selfish ambition as being demonic, it's kind of a theologically charged word, isn't it? And so you say, well, what does he mean by demonic? And I think the notion and the idea that he's conveying here is the idea and the notion that it's devoid of the good of God or of the goodness of God. It's devoid of those things and the intentions that God has for all of his creation. It's that which wants to take away life rather than give life. Now he's going to talk about, rather than selfish or bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, he's going to talk about and explain what the wisdom from above, the wisdom of God, holy wisdom, looks like. And so it's important because we're going to get into James's mind as to what it is that godly wisdom, what it is that it looks like. You can use this text and kind of bring together the 7 pillars of wisdom that's talked about in the book of Proverbs. When you kind of hear them, you're kind of hearing the same things here, but maybe in James's way of saying it. So this is what he says. He says, verse 17, but the wisdom from above, and this is what he says, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of good mercy and good fruits. We'll stop there and we'll go through some of these. Okay, the first one he says is that the wisdom that's from above is first pure. And this doesn't have to do with in timing. It just has to do with in understanding what it looks like, what it is in a tangible way. So what he's saying there when he says that the wisdom that comes up or that comes from above is pure, it's completely pure and perfect because it doesn't have any mixture of anything else in it but this idea of purity, of oneness, of not being mixed with something else. I'll give you an example of that. We just talked about the word zeal or jealousy. So we would say that God is jealous for us like a husband. Right? So we talked about that, and we talked about God, or that Jesus was jealous for the house of God, so he drove out the money changers. So in that way, in this form of zeal that we're talking about, it was this pure zeal for the good. It was this jealousy for the pure good. And so what he's saying is that the wisdom from above can't be mixed with any kind of self-interest, and it can't be mixed with any kind of bitter zeal or self-interesting zeal. It's got to be that pure wisdom that comes from above, from God, that isn't tainted by any of our passions, by any of our desires, by any of our wants. It stands alone in its entity. It's almost like the idea of having a pure glass of water and then mixing some dye into it, or maybe putting some sugar into it, or putting salt into it, or putting dirt into it. It's no longer that pure substance. So he's saying here, God's wisdom always has this unity of purity to it. Why would that be? Because it would have to be perfect if it's the wisdom of God, because it comes from the perfect wisdom of God. So it's I know that that's kind of an abstract principle, but he's going to kind of bring it down still a little bit further and break it down as to what wisdom looks like. The second thing that he says about it is he says that it's peaceful, right? So it's filled with peace. So when you understand or hear the wisdom of God, what happens is you find it is peaceful in your soul. In other words, it sets well with you. It stops conflict in you. So we think about in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus was talking about the Beatitudes, and he said, and he basically said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall find peace." So it's the idea of that when the wisdom of God comes in, it doesn't come in with conflict. It doesn't cause conflict because it's pure and you know it's right. And so there's not a conflict in your soul. And so you rest with it because you know it's true. Has God ever just spoken something to you, or have you read something in Scripture that God revealed something to you about it, where you just knew that when He said it, it was true, and you were at peace with it? You just knew it was true. And so what James is saying is that's what holy wisdom does. When you hear it, you know it's pure, and it also sets well in your soul. Your soul's not conflicted with it because you know it to be true. The third thing that he says that it is there then is he says it's gentle. And this word gentle is interesting and reasonable. So in this word gentle, he's talking about, it's the idea of humility. It's the idea of controlled strength, like we talked about when we talk about fortitude, for instance, where we talk about that it's strength of mind. And so when it comes, it doesn't come in by force and it doesn't come in loudly. It kind of just sits there in humility in its pure form. There's a strength to it, but you also know that when you see it in a person, let's put this into a wise person. You can see a wise person as being pure and being at peace with themselves. And in speaking to you about wise things, you can see where they would have a strength of mind and a gentleness about them, a controlled strength about them, where they didn't have to overexert themselves to get what it is that they thought was best. It's almost like the idea of somebody that's in power and they have the power, maybe a judge, to put you into prison. But they don't have to exert that power all the time. They would reserve that for other times, but they have that power, but they restrict or hold back that power. Well, see, the wisdom of God is very similar to that. It's got this strength to it. And people that exhibit it, they have this knowledge and this base of wisdom, but they know when to pull it back and when to be humble in wisdom. So the wisdom from above is always humble. I was talking with a professor in class, and actually it was in an appointment, just a one-on-one with him, and we were talking about Thomas Aquinas. And in talking about Thomas Aquinas, he says, "Carl, it's important for you to understand that one of the biggest values of Thomas Aquinas' learning posture was that of humility. That Aquinas believed that if you didn't start from a position of humility, then you couldn't learn at all. So real wisdom, godly wisdom, is pure. It's peaceful, but it also has humility mixed in with it. And that humility isn't where it's some kind of a false humility where we think we're a worm. It has a notion and the idea of what we just talked about, of controlled strength, of meekness. We talked about this in the past, about a broken stallion. The stallion still has all of its strength, but it's controlled by the master. In this case, the humble man is the one that's controlled by his master, and that master is wisdom. So wisdom becomes the master of our emotions and us, and then also in areas of pride and humility. The next thing he says is that after gentle, it says reasonable. So the idea is that after being gentle, it's also reasonable. In other words, when you hear wisdom, it makes sense, doesn't it? Have you ever had somebody say something wise to you, and you just simply went and said, well, that makes perfect sense to me. It's very rational. And maybe sometimes somebody says something to you, and it doesn't make sense, and you ask them to explain it, and they're able to rationally explain exactly why something is right, why it would be, what would justice look like in this situation, what would courage look like in this situation, what would the love of God look like in this situation, and they would be able to reason well through the different virtues so that they could act morally in the world and working out of this operation of wisdom, or the wisdom of God concerning their moral character. That's what James is talking about here. And so the idea of reasonableness is the idea of us being rational in things. There's nothing, how many times have you seen Christians when they're acting irrationally, and maybe some of the things that they're believing, some of the things that they're saying, some of the things that they're doing. And basically, the wisdom of God infers to some extent that because we're rational beings, He's given us the ability to rationally think through some things. Now, for us to be able to think through things rationally is a sign that we're wise. Well, think about it. How many times have you gone out and bought something irrationally? Maybe it was a car. You're young. When you're in your younger days, you decided you had to have a new car. And so you went out and bought a new car and you knew you couldn't afford that car. Well, but something in there made you want to buy that car, but you didn't rationally think about it. Then a year later, when you're strapped with payments, you're regretting the move that you made irrationally. So wisdom, as we acquire wisdom, we become more rational, not less rational. The next one that we want to talk about here, and I'm going to hot rod this because we're going to run out of time. The next one that he talks about here is full of mercy. So the idea is that true wisdom always has mercy in it. It's not always about judgment. Remember what Jesus said when He said that mercy triumphs over judgment. So there's this part where mercy is more important. I guess that wasn't Jesus that said that. But the idea, but it's still in Scripture. Mercy triumphs over judgment. That mercy, although He lived it in His life, so I guess He could really say it as well. But mercy is more important than judgment. Extending mercy and favor to people is something that wisdom does. Because a wise person understands that they've got enough to worry about in running their own life rather than to worry about judging you for what you're doing in your life. Because all of us can acquire more wisdom. So the wise man and woman is always full of mercy and grace. The next thing it says after mercy is good fruits. That out of their life, there are good fruits. Goodness comes from them in everything that they do. Have you ever met anybody like that? Where they're just good people, and what happens is whatever they do is for the good of others. There's something beautiful about a person like that, isn't there? Every one of us loves a person like that. And it also says then here, and the last two, it says unwavering. So the idea of that, in the idea of being unwavering is never unsure of yourself, never hesitant of the fact that when wisdom is there, that you know the right things to do. And so you're not going to be tempted to do the wrong things, because when wisdom dictates what is right, you're unwavering in following the voice of wisdom. That which is pure, like we're talking, that which is peaceful, that which is humble, that which is full of mercy, that which is full of good fruits. And so you're unwavering in making sure that that's the way that you live your life. And then the last one, it says here, without hypocrisy, which kind of can be translated without partiality. In other words, you don't treat one person different than you treat another person. You treat everybody with this way of no partiality. And so you can see where you can kind of find these seven, or you can really make 7 pillars out of what it is that James is talking about. It's the idea of pure. It's the idea of peaceable. It's the idea of gentle or humble. It's mercy. It's good fruits. It's unwavering. It's always solid. It's that courage with strength of mind, where your mind's so strong, you're not going to be deterred, right? And it's without partiality. You don't put people on the margins. You include everybody. As a matter of fact, those that are on the margins, you invite in. And then what he says about the wise person is this: and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the wise person, the truly wise person, is the one that understands these different virtues that we've been talking about, and by them sows the seed of peace and the seed of righteousness in other people. In other words, the wise woman or the wise man are the ones that are always at peace and looking for peace and the way to provide peace in people's lives. Now, I can tell you that I've said a lot here, and there's a lot more that could be said, and maybe I wasn't clear on a lot of things that I did say. But if you stop and ponder these scriptures and think about it and go back and reread it, I think what you're going to find is there's a lot to be said here. But more importantly than that is, if we begin to live these, if we begin to pursue these things, then we begin to change. And what we find is our life is full of good, ripe fruit for ourselves and for others. And with that, we find ourselves much more at peace and able to sow peace in other people's lives, to teach people the ways of wisdom, the ways of righteousness, so that they become better people as we ourselves. It's a process. And it starts with us saying yes, but it is also to pursue wisdom for the rest of our life. I guess today I'm asking you one thing. Will you say yes to pursuing wisdom? God bless you. Have a great day, and I hope to see you soon.